Immediately, when I officially arrived in El Paso around 4 p.m. Mountain Time, I was scouting for the border wall. It had been 2 years since I first saw the barrier between two uniquely distinct worlds that seep into each other and are physically divided by tall pieces of rusting steel that have aided in causing some of the effects that brought me to El Paso in the first place. A portion of the border can be seen on the outskirts of Texas Loop 375, also known as the Cesar Chavez Border Highway. If you're unfamiliar with who Cesar Chavez is, you may have run into a park, a street, a community, and other places named after him across the United States, most commonly in the southern states. He was born into a family that later became migrant farm workers during the Great Depression in California. Chavez spent most of his life doing agricultural work, which inspired him to improve the working, living conditions, and wages for farm workers in the USA by creating the United Farm Workers of America. The organization was able to advocate and achieve specific goals for its mission through non-violent practices inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I couldn't lose sight of the border. I was staring at the very wall that is monumental in news stories, films, and other articles I've seen. The abundance of nationalities, languages, cultures, and people unifying and clashing at the border was a puzzling idea with more questions than answers. I was aware that I was going to meet people that felt the need to move geographically because their prior homes were a place of perturbation from either war, violence, economic devastation, or because they were seeking other opportunities that didn't exist where they lived. However, what about the history of the border? Why has such a man-made barrier gone up in the first place? I asked a professor at Texas A&M University to enlighten me on my curiosity.
Well, oftentimes when I'm asked about the history of the US-Mexican border, I usually tell people that it's not, I can't give them a simple definition. The border, as we know it today, the modern day geopolitical division between the United States and Mexico took place in 1848. That border was drawn in 1848, but the events, historical moments leading up to that drawing of the line is rich and long. And I think it's important to talk a little bit about how we have come to know the border as it is now. The area that became incorporated into the United States, that is part of what was at one point land inhabited and controlled by a variety of Native American groups, and eventually claimed by the Spanish Empire by the early 17th century, has a long history that predates 1848. And so I think it's important for people to know that there was a vibrant culture, life, and the thriving of many communities in the pre-1848 period. But because I don't have a lot of time, let's get to 1848. We know that the US-Mexican border was born out of violence. It was a product of war. It basically marked the end of the war between the United States and Mexico, fought in 1846 and ended in 1848, and it ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now there were several factors that contributed to the eventual breakout of the war, which brings us to the creation of the geopolitical boundary, and that had a lot to do with the loss of Texas, the loss of Texas in the 1830s primarily over the issue of slavery, as Mexico had abolished slavery in 1821. And the Texans, including Tejanos, felt that this was detrimental, that the abolishment of slavery was detrimental to the growth of Texas as they saw it. And that was a driving factor of the Texas Revolt, or the Texas Fight for Independence, or the Texas Revolution, whatever terminology you wish to use. And so 1848 comes along, but it's important to note that the border was more of a line on a map than some kind of dividing thing for communities on both sides of the border. Let's remember that settlement in that area, in terms of permanent settlements tied to the Spanish period of exploration, date back to 1749. If we look at the present day Texas, Tamaulipas, Texas, Nuevo Leon border area. And so it's not until the early 20th century that we can talk about efforts to seal the border, tied to these larger ideas about national security, tied to these ideas about belonging and not belonging as well, because the border functioned in many ways as a marker to limit the entrance of certain people and the exclusion of others. Some of the first policies related to immigration control had to do with Asian and Asian American peoples. So we think of the late 19th century and look at policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act. That policy had serious consequences, not only for the Asian origin population, but also the Mexican origin population. And there are historians who have looked at these parallels between efforts on the part of the federal government to limit the entrance of Asian peoples, and how that eventually affected, informed, shaped future immigration policies targeting Mexican origin people. In fact, one could argue, and there's literature on this topic, one could argue that the first humans to be smuggled across the US-Mexican border were of Chinese origin after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And many Chinese and Chinese Americans and eventually Chinese Mexicans had made their way to Mexico and attempted to return to their communities or find new homes, getting back into the United States via Mexico, principally through the western end of the U.S.-Mexican border. In the aftermath of all of this, you have events leading up to or getting the United States closer into the entering what was known as the Great War, what we call today World War I. And this coincides with growing anxieties, oftentimes hyped up by the media, primarily newspapers, and local, state, and national politicians about, the fear of an invasion from Mexico, and given the developments taking place in Mexico that would eventually lead to the Mexican Revolution of 1910. one of the bloodiest revolutions of the 20th century. And so a lot of the discourse around the exclusion of certain groups of people has a lot to do with these larger developments, and in many ways, larger global developments that were taking place and shaped the kinds of ideas and the kinds of attitudes people had about Mexican origin population, which also affected the Mexican Americans who were living in places like Texas, New Mexico, California, and other places in the Southwest.
Being visually stimulated by a place I had yet to adapt to heightened my intrigue for the land I was visiting. I was surrounded by geography and culture that I couldn't wait to explore, and that's precisely what I began to do.